Greeting, fellow natural historians, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation, More Than Mushrooms, the Unsung Heroes, perhaps, of the Kingdom, perhaps, of the Fungus. Um, Welcome to today's presentation. Thanks for joining us, as I said. And today we are exploring the fungus. I am James Stevenson, and I am with the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, right here in Pinellas County. We are an extension of the University of Florida. We provide research-based information. We don't sell anything. Well, loosely speaking, we're not peddlers. We give free information to help people make decisions in their lives. That don't end up being expensive problems for our local government. So we do serve an important educational bridge between the people who live here in Pinellas County and where the information for our county comes from the University of Florida. I'm coming to you from Brooker Creek Preserve. If you haven't visited the preserve, it's definitely time that you did. If you're anywhere within striking distance of Brooker Creek Preserve in North Pinellas County, we are open every single day of the year except for Christmas Day and the day after Thanksgiving. Our trails are open for public use, people only, to come and observe natural Florida as it existed before people got here. And it's a great place to look for fungus, as we'll discover about how fungus kind of live everywhere. So let's take a look at what are the fungi. What are these things? Most people, when you mention fungus, are going to automatically go to mushrooms. This is a picture of some very, very typical mushrooms being very, very typical growing out of an old dead log. Many mushroom species, fungus, will pop up out of the ground seemingly overnight, appearing seemingly out of nowhere. But it's what people have in mind when we say fungus. And today's presentation is more than mushrooms. We're going beyond the mushrooms. We're giving you guys a little bit of a 2.0. There's plenty of resources available on mushroom biology and identification. There's a huge interest, of course, in wild collected edible mushrooms as a resource, a renewable resource that can be harvested from the wild and eaten and consumed. Of course, there's all kinds of folklore and pop culture surrounding this practice of harvesting wild mushrooms. We, of course, are aware, hopefully, that many species of wild mushrooms are, in fact, toxic, perhaps even deadly, poisonous. So it's a subject that needs to be approached with someone or some ones who are extremely well versed in wild collected mushrooms. So that's why we're not going there today. That's the primary reason. We hope that you read the description clearly when you signed up for today's class, and that's not what we're going to be talking about. We'll leave that to the experts. And what we're going to focus on is what the rest of them are. What are the fungi? Well, here it is. Not too impressive. Here's some more. This is what the fungus writ large look like. The fungus are threads that thread together our ecosystems, microscopic, hidden, cryptic threads that weave through almost every single ecosystem known of living organisms, going about their life cycles as these incredibly amazing and cryptic group of organisms, separate from the animals, separate from the plants, and they consist of these very hardworking strands, these hollow tubes called hyphae. The fungus are the hyphae, the working fungus that live, eat, and reproduce are these, I almost want to say the word invisible, these microscopic threads that again weave through entire ecosystems, joining in with other members of that ecosystem, be it other fungus species, be it animal species, be it plant species, and literally knitting all of these organisms together. And it's these invisible strands, these transparent hyphae, that make up the majority of the fungus. Here's a really bad drawing that I've done of hypha, this strand of fungal material. Remember, it's transparent, and it's made of these multinucleate cells. Do you remember nucleus? Do you remember that the nucleus of a cell is a very important thing? It's where all the DNA is wound up, and it's where the information is stored on making all the other parts of the cell so that when the cell divides, it can remember all this. Well, fungal cells are most often multinucleate, and those elongated cells form these nearly microscopic strands that are referred to as hypha. They are often separated by septum. Septa is the plural of septums. And they can branch and grow and elongate and again weave their way through ecosystems. This is how the fungus grows, by the elongation and branching of these hypha. The way that the fungus eat, the way they consume their food source, is by secreting enzymes outside of their growing body, these hyphal strands, secretion of enzymes into the environment. Those enzymes then break down, digest the environment that the fungus is growing in, making then that digested material, that digested environment where the fungus is growing, available for reabsorption. So it's almost like as the fungal hyphae grow through the environment, they're just melting it away and then reabsorbing the deconstructed, complex molecules of the environment. And fungus is an unsung hero of ecosystems. It takes all the dead plant material, all the detritus, all the fallen logs, all the excreted parts of dead animals, live animals, manure, everything that gets naturally dumped into the environment in a complicated state is then broken down into its individual components by the activity of these threads, these fungal threads that weave their way through these environments. That those threads then digest, decompose, and melt away those components and make them into their simpler basic units, taking complex molecules and breaking them into smaller parts that the fungus can then absorb, making a lot of biomass reduced to its elemental, its elements, breaking it down. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is how fungus writ large, this is how this group of living organisms survives. The fungus are not plants. Remember, plants and the algae, the photosynthetic organisms that can make their own food, and the animals that then can eat those things that the plants make. Well, this is a third way of living. The fungus doesn't make food, it doesn't eat food. It breaks down complex molecules that have been made by the producers or processed by the animals and break it down even further and reabsorb. So it's a completely different way of occupying this planet that we're on. Now, when it's time for the fungus to reproduce itself, those hyphae, those threads, those tubes that wind their way through the environment, they will knit together. They will come together, bind together, become very densely packed into a spongy material that might be familiar as what we're mostly familiar with when we talk about fungus, the mushrooms. Mushrooms, fungal fruiting bodies. When it's time, the hyphae knit themselves together and create. Each species creates its own fruiting body. The ones that we're most familiar with, of course, are the mushrooms, as far as fungus goes, but there are many, many more that we're going to talk about today. And that's just an expression of reproduction for the fungus. So the majority of the organism is living in the substrate, branching, growing, digesting, reabsorbing, aging. And then when it comes time to reproduce, it sticks these reproductive structures up into the air, because you probably have heard how the fungus, as a living group of organisms, how they reproduce. They produce spores. And spores are very, very specialized single cells that need to be airborne to jump to a new habitat to germinate and grow into a new generation of fungus. Now, there are water fungus. We're not going to go into that today because this is such a broad enough subject as it is. We're not even going to scratch the surface. We're just going to look at the surface of this incredibly complex group of organisms. Now, I'm a botanist. If anyone has sat through any lectures before, you've probably gathered that, if I haven't made it expressly clear. Early natural historians kind of foisted the fungus upon the botanists because a lot of them come out of the ground, and they don't have a face. They don't make any noise. They must be plants, or they're more like plants than animals, so let's give them to the botanist. But they're not plants. They're not even close to plants. There is an accepted, a conventional organization of life on Earth into 6 different kingdoms of life. Now, bear with me. I'm going to go on a little tangent, but it's germane to today's presentation. So life on Earth, 6 different kingdoms. We have the animals, right? Everything from a mouse to an elephant, a sparrow to a jellyfish, all the animals belong to a single kingdom. And they are unique to and live alongside of the kingdom of life that is referred to as the plants. Remember, these are the ones that can photosynthesize and make the leaves that are then food for the herbivores, and the nectar that's food for the butterfly, and all the stuff that the plants do. A separate kingdom from that, the fungi, these are the decomposers. We just met them. They send these threads through the substrate, rot out the substrate, reabsorb, facilitate that decomposition, that cycling of nutrients, so nothing builds up too high because we have the fungus breaking it down. There's also a kingdom of organisms that are referred to as the protists, the little single-celled organisms that have just kind of figured out how to get just so big and make their living usually in an aquatic system. And of course, you've heard of the bacteria. For better, for worse, for good or for bad, the bacteria exist as a separate kingdom of life. They have their own way of living, they have their own way of reproducing, a very simplified, a very basic structure, and a kind of more or less recently, within my lifetime, group of organisms that are referred to as the archaebacteria, the archaea. They kind of represent what's left of the very first experiment in life on Earth when conditions were absolutely, unbearable. Life figured out how to organize and exist and reproduce and multiply, and life sparked. It started in what would be considered inhospitable conditions. Life arose, diversified, and thrived. And this group, the archaebacteria, kind of represent the living members of those original pioneers on Earth. So this is kind of the conventional wisdom of how we organize life on Earth. We've got the animals, the plants, the fungus, the protists. Forget about all these. We're talking about the fungus today, but I just want to underscore that what we're talking about is a completely separate group on the tree of life. And speaking of tree of life, if you want to waste the rest of your afternoon, and I promise you it could be done, look up the Open Tree of Life. This is a live project that is fed by research biologists all over the world. It is the next step in the organization of life on Earth. And it throws a bit of nuance into the concept of these 6 discrete kingdoms and provides more of a spectrum of life, from the very least specialized, those archaebacteria, all the way through with branches of complication and specialization along the way. You can search this tree of life, and it actually does look something like a tree. And what you see when you search this is this more nuanced, spectral, not as discrete classification of life on Earth. So what we're looking at here is the furthest zooming out of the tree of life. And what we have here is the ancestor of all living things, the very first organization of something that could reproduce itself. And progressing along the trunk of this tree of life represents the time and diversification of that original organism, and the branches off represent some more of these more discrete bundles. We have very early on the bacteria breaking off, the organisms that can produce methane, the anaerobic extremophiles, those things that can live inside of rocks. So all these branches on the tree of life, and it doesn't get until far along till we get to the point where we come to the bit of the tree of life that are the living groups of organisms that we know, that we relate to, the ones that have the nucleus in their cells. And that's these 4, the animals, the plants, the fungus, and the protists. It's kind of the life as we know it. So here on the branch of the tree of life, we have these eukaryotes. Stay with me. We have these eukaryotes, and early branching gives us the group that includes the plants, period. And from here, all the diversity of plants radiates out. Moving on along And as time and diversification and experiments, these organisms experimented and succeeded and failed, those success stories led us to this group here that includes the animals, the fungus, and the rest. So not only are fungus not plants, they're not even closely related to plants. The plants branched off and diversified on their own. The fungus and the animals had things figured out in their own way as an organism, as a common ancestor that had characteristics of fungus and animal life both, and diversified, and we got a branch that only contains the fungus, and that's what we'll be looking at today. So fungus, more like animals in their feeding, in their chemical composition, so much more like animals than plants. But fungi, they are everywhere. Very, very specialized, very, very adaptable, with that cryptic lifestyle of living in the environment that they are actively decomposing. Many species actively decomposing their environment as a way of making a living. It's a pretty easy living, right? So lots of possibility, lots of ability to reproduce, lots of experiments over the billions of years that life has been organizing itself and coming up with these experiments through mutation. Some are successful, some are not successful. Those that are successful, some can then outcompete others. We end up with the diversity of stuff like this, which is jelly. Something you might find growing out of a dead log in the forest. This is a living thing. This is going through all the processes that we use to define a living organism: respiration, feeding, reproduction, reproducing itself, so on. And yet it exists as this glob, no eyes, no feelers, no central nervous system, but yet a functioning living organism. And the fungus that we'll look at today have some of these really fantastic names, like which is jelly, blight, smut, and rust. Don't have the best reputations, right? Earth star, earth tongue, stink horn, very colorful. Lots, and as I mentioned before, lots of mythology surrounding fungus because they're mysterious. They come out of nowhere. Some stink, some can kill you. Very revered group of organisms on Earth. The study of fungus is called mycology. A mycologist is a fungal specialist. Myco, M-Y-C-O, is the root that is inserted into certain vocabulary words that have to do with the study or products related to fungal issues. A mycologist. I'm trying to think of another one. I'm sure it'll come to me. But the fungus, again, this group of organisms that has a huge diversity, they have various different sources of food, shall we say. They have this ability to dissolve their environment. Well, what kind of environments do they live in? Some fungus are considered saprotrophic, where they do this classical breakdown of organic materials. The decomposers, living in the leaf mold, in your compost pile, that sort of thing. There are species of fungus that have adapted those feeding tubes, that mycelium, that hyphae, that network of branching microscopic tubes, to act parasitically, where they will actually go in and parasitize perhaps an autotroph, a plant. They will parasitize that plant, get their tubes fused with the plant tubes without hurting the plant, and just steal all that photosynthetic sugar. done pretty easy living, right? Others are pathogenic. And of course, you might have heard of certain fungal disease. Um, these are fungal organisms who have adapted the ability to use those, uh, those tubes, that hyphae, to plumb into living material and feed to the detriment of that host organism. And even though death might ensue, it is for the good of that fungal pathogen. The fungal pathogen has written that into the script, that even though the host is going to die, I'm still going to go ahead and pursue this way of living. I have one slide of such a pathogenic fungus. It's called cordyceps. I was amazed to find on my last visit to a health food store that you can buy cordyceps fungus to eat. And cordyceps is a known insect zombifier. I didn't stick around long enough to find out what cordyceps is meant to do to people, but let me just tell you what it does to insects. This is a species of cordyceps fungus. There's a lot going on in this slide. First, we have the ant. This ant is dead. This ant was standing underneath a blade of grass where cordyceps fungus released some spores from above. And those cordyceps fungal spores landed on the ant's head. And the spores, being specialized single cells that are stimulated to germinate and grow, found themselves in just the right place, the head of an ant of a particular species. So that spore germinated and grew, and those tubes that grew out of the spore and began to branch into the hyphae that we saw drawn before worked their way into the ant's body and branched and began to decompose and get a little bit of nutrient out of the living ant tissue. But where the hyphae really concentrated was towards the little rudimentary brain of this ant, and it took over. And it sent signals in the form of fake hormones that the fungus created just to direct the activity of this ant, and it caused the ant's own brain to defy itself. And it told the ant to climb higher and higher and higher. And so the ant just did. It wasn't in control anymore. And once the ant had found itself on the top of the tallest sprig of grass, the cordyceps hyphae knitted themselves together and created this long structure of knitted hyphae where the spores will be produced to rain down on this ant's sisters, thus completing the cycle of taking over an ant's brain, sending it to the top of a tree, in effect, a blade of grass, to rain the spores down on the unsuspecting ants below. So this is an example of a pathogenic fungus who doesn't care, in this case, that the host dies, because it's completing its life cycle, using its hyphae to feed on the living tissue of the ant, and when it's done, controlling the ant's activities to send it to the top of a tall place where it can rain it down. Now, what's this red thing? This is, it looks like this is a type of fly that's secondary. This one's just kind of, in this photograph, this one's just kind of coming in to check out what's going on and to see if there's any scraps, perhaps, that that this fly could take advantage of. Is the cordyceps going to be dangerous to this fly? No. Such is the specialization amongst the species of fungus and their specific hosts that some are toxic to only one particular species or not necessarily in this case toxic, but dangerous, pathogenic. Other species can have these spores land on them. You and I can have cordyceps fungus spores, and fingers crossed it's not going to take over your brain and make you go stand on the roof until you turn into a giant puffball. Hopefully. I don't know of a case of that happening. Other feeding mechanisms that are more specialized, that they might actually involve several of the previously mentioned mechanisms. There's a mycorrhizal mechanism that is really the study of mycorrhizal associations is young, is nascent, is undergoing a huge development right now, and we're getting more understanding, and we're finding out amazing things about how certain fungus can not only plumb their way into particular plant roots or stems or leaves to steal the nutrient, but they can attach one plant to another. The same fungal tubes can they can wire or plumb. I use the analogy of plumbing a lot because I think of the fluids that plants pass through their vascular systems. But it's the fungal tubes that facilitate this passage of nutrient and the passage of hormones and the passage of other synthates that plants create to heal wounds, to cure diseases, to fend off attacking insects, to respond to other environmental stresses. And it's being found more and more that through the activity of these mycorrhizal fungus, that every single plant in a forest is connected to each other. And if one plant is in distress and creates distress hormones or chemicals or some other sort of reactionary chemical or signal, that other species can then send help through these mycorrhizal associations. Now, I say it all the time, it's not all Snow White out there. We might have a plant that's sending out distress signals, help, I'm getting weaker and weaker. Those signals might be interpreted by another plant who might go in and just finish that thing off. So, mycorrhizal associations, we'll study those in depth. Next month, January 19th will be the webinar, this version, and we'll do it again live in person on the 22nd. We'll talk about this wood wide web, the knitting together of entire forest ecosystems. Okay, everyone all right? Are we okay? We're a pretty good group here today. So if you do have any pressing questions or comments or complaints, don't hesitate to pop something in the chat. I believe that is available to you. We also have Julia co-hosting today who can keep an eye on things as well. And thank you very much to Julia. So, how do fungus grow? Remember, fungus, they grow through these very fine, transparent, hollow tubes, multinucleate, sometimes septate, these hyphae. This is a picture of the hyphae of the oyster mushroom. Yes, an edible mushroom. What do you think it tastes like? The oyster mushroom. When we refer to this greater mass of hyphae, when we open the soil and see lots and lots and lots of this cotton candy, white cotton candy threads, it's not referred to as hyphae really anymore. When we're talking about a huge mass of hyphae, it has its own name. It's referred to then as this mycelium. I don't know why. It's not my fault. It's just how it is. There's a word for every single thing. We talk about this mycelium as this mass of hyphae. And again, this happens to be a photograph of the mycelium of the oyster mushroom. And we're going to make this available to you to observe in April we're going to have a mushroom workshop, a real mushroom workshop. We'll go all in on mushrooms. How about that? And we will be providing mushroom grow kits. So you can get one of these kits that's produced by our friends at Back to the Roots, with substrate that's inoculated with the oyster mushroom spores. Just adding water, you can see those spores turn into hyphae, turn into mycelium, and eventually that mycelium knitting together to form oyster mushrooms that you can eat. That'll be in April. More details to follow on that. We're really excited about offering that. But first, you have to know more about fungus in general. I said it before very briefly, but when the mycelium knits together, when the hyphae knits together and forms that three-dimensional structure that it uses for reproduction, that three-dimensional structure in fungus is referred to a fruiting body. It's just what it's called, fruiting body. And really, it's the only way that we can figure out what species we're looking at. If you turn over some earth and find the cotton candy mycelium, I would be well impressed if you could identify that fungus. When that stuff knits its own self together and pops up and forms the fruiting body, that's when we can really identify what's growing above ground. And this is what forms the mushrooms that we know and the other fungus that we'll be looking at today, other than mushrooms. So here you can see a few examples of the fruiting bodies and the diversity of the fruiting bodies of the different species within the diversity of this enormous group of organisms that are collectively known as the fungus. So let's take a look at some of the major groups. You know me, you know what I like to do. We have a complex group of organisms that are all related. That's nice enough, but we're still stuck with 36,000. How can we break all those down and put them into nice discrete bundles that then we can study one at a time? Well, thankfully, this monstrous group of organisms, these animal-like, weird, cryptic mycelium things, they actually fall into three very nice, more than three, but three nicely chewed on, I shouldn't say that, nicely considered groups. Zygomycetes, Ascomycetes, and Basidiomycetes. I know, big words, funny letters, Z's and Y's and C's and E's and all that. Not necessarily worth writing down or memorizing. Just know that we've got this group of organisms, the fungus. Let's look at one group of fungus and see what they have in common. The Zygomycetes and some of the familiar examples of the Zygomycetes. These include the agents of decay. And we all know how easy it is to grow fungus. All we have to do is be, sloppy or forgetful. As mentioned before, fungus is everywhere. Those spores, those microscopic single cells with the potential to germinate and grow into that field of hyphal tubes, dissolving their surroundings and reabsorbing the nutrient. One of the Zygomycetes is the black bread mold, Rhizopus stolonifer. And this is just one example of a type of fungus that might appear seemingly out of nowhere, again magically, on a discarded, in this case, loaf of bread. The hyphae, the spore germinated, the hyphae that grew, secreted the enzymes into the environment, which happened to be bread. In this case, it was just right for this species. And so the enzymes were secreted, broke down whatever the bread is made of, the proteins, the carbohydrates, all the things that the plants had made that went into the creation of the flour that's in the bread. And so this Rhizopus, let's look at it really close. Here we have, again, those translucent threads. In this case, those translucent threads are in their reproductive phase, a very simple reproductive phase in the Zygomycetes, where it's just the tip of the hyphae specializes and creates a little ball of spores that it can then release. Those single cells can then drift through the air and hopefully find another abandoned loaf of bread or some other substrate that are suitable for the growth of the hyphae of the black bread mold. Another member of this group, Pilobolus. Love this one. This is one that in secondary school you can get a Pilobolus growing kit. It's not a fungus to eat. It's just one to watch because it's hilarious. It's literally called the hat thrower Pilobolus. There's a dance company called Pilobolus, or there used to be. I guess they would throw their hats off at the end of the performance. I don't know. But what we have here is a lump of dung, and we know what dung is. What we're seeing here is a nice ball of poo. What we're also looking at are the fruiting bodies of the Pilobolus fungus. The hyphae are all inside this lump of manure, poo. The fruiting bodies have stuck up, and those little black dots, those are the hats. Those are full of the spores of this fungus that, when ripe, the little swollen tube here, the little mycelium, the little hyphal tube is under pressure. And when everything is just right, the pressure is going to release and toss this little black dot up into the air. And you can notice they're all kind of facing the same way. They can detect light. They can kind of see. So they're all pointing towards the light because they know that if they throw their spores somewhere in the light, it's likely to land on some grass that another herbivore is then going to eat. So the herbivore then eats the grass with the Pilobolus spores on it, chews it up, swallows it, sends it through its gut, creating for those Pilobolus spores just what they want, another hunk of manure. Plop. The spores grow, the mycelium grows through the dung, pops out the top, and starts the cycle over again. See? Not everything is here for our benefit. Some things just are. Another one of the pathogenic fungus, the insect destroyer. This is another example. This is not cordyceps. This is another fungus with a similar reproductive strategy of sending these airborne microscopic single-celled spores out into the environment, hoping, if fungus could hope, that the spores are going to land on a suitable host, in this case, a certain species of fly, where the spore germinates, grows, takes over, begins to digest and feed on the internal body parts of the fly, eventually takes over the brain, again, like cordyceps, same mechanism that evolved separately. Seems like a good way to be. And then eventually fills the entire body cavity of this fly up with its strands of mycelium, then producing the spore-producing structures that release the spores into the environment. Gruesome, but this is all happening. Fungus is everywhere. The two biggest groups of the fungus and the two most obvious groups of terrestrial fungus. Like I said, we're not really going to get in the water fungus or any of the extremophilic fungus. And again, we're not even scratching the surface. We're just looking at the surface of this fantastically complex group of organisms. But these two, the Ascomycetes and the Basidiomycetes, these are the two biggies. These are the two that have diversified the most here on land. Macroscopically, we can observe, pick, hold, smell, touch, break these. The Ascomycetes are the largest group of all, with these 64,000 different species. They get their name from the case that their spores are held in. They all have an asci, an ascocarp with the ascospores inside. It means wineskin. A very diverse group, the Ascomycetes. Some are mycorrhizal, which is that wood wide web that we'll look at next month. These are the fungus of the leafcutter ants. You know, the leafcutter ants that go and collect pieces of leaves and then they grow the fungus gardens. That's a type of Ascomycete. Bark beetles, very important ecologically and economically. The beetles, these carry little, I call them little lunch boxes, little knapsacks with Ascomycete fungus that the bark beetles fly from tree to tree and plant the fungus inside the tree, where the fungus then grows, kills the tree, allows the beetles access to all those chambers and the ability to break down the wood and so on. Powdery mildew, one of the powdery mildews is an Ascomycete. Candida, a human disease, is a type of Ascomycete. And the source of cyclosporin, the natural source of cyclosporin, which has a host of medical applications, is an Ascomycete fungus. But they all have this structure. As diverse a group as they are, they reproduce, they have a common ancestor that came up with the idea or experiment of producing these 8 to 16 spores inside of an ascus. It's a little sack of spores. Probably the most famous Ascomycete, Penicillium. In the wild, growing as a greenish mold. In human times, has become kind of a friend, hasn't it? Initially, it was a laboratory accident that led to the discovery that some species of fungus have antimicrobial capabilities, because it's a war out there. I'm pointing out the window. It's a war out there. And we know that there's the fungal kingdom of life, and we know that there's the bacterial kingdom of life. And perhaps you're aware that bacteria also like to break down their environment. They're also decomposers. So they're kind of competing with certain fungus. So when there's competition, there's oftentimes defense. And certain bacteria might try and defend themselves against fungus so that they can have access to the same materials if there's some competition for resources. And likewise, fungus might have to do their best to prevent themselves from being attacked from the byproducts, the perhaps toxic byproducts or activity of certain bacteria. A laboratory accident. A scientist was trying to grow bacteria, a pathogenic bacteria, on a petri dish, and some wild green bread mold, Penicillium, contaminated that petri dish. And the scientist noticed there's this halo where the bacteria is being thwarted, where there's some antimicrobial, antibacterial, antibiotic activity of the penicillium against that bacteria. And of course, humans have made huge use of penicillium as a natural, originally natural antibiotic, but it was down to this by chance contamination of some laboratory equipment. There are other species of penicillium which by chance have contaminated certain human products like cheese for the better, some would argue. There's a species of Penicillium that gives the charismatic, characteristic flavor, texture, color to Roquefort cheese. It's actually its own species. And to produce Roquefort cheese, the dairy product needs to be inoculated with the correct species of Penicillium in order for that cheese to be called Roquefort. Same with Camembert. There is a plant pathogen of the grasses. Cultivated grasses are referred to as the grains. Their seeds are what we grind into the many different types of flours: wheat flour, barley, rye, oats. Certain species have particular grass hosts where they use their hyphae to go in and eat and become a pathogen of that plant, perhaps just a parasite keeping that plant alive. Then when it's time to reproduce, the spores are produced in a place where they might be eaten and pass through a digestive system and planted along with the seeds of another grass somewhere else. The byproducts of this particular fungus and the related rusts and smut fungus, they can contaminate grain harvests. They can be toxic. They have been blamed on certain otherwise unexplained events in human history. Ergotism, certain mass hysterias have been blamed on the consumption of grain, a bread that was produced from grain that was infected with certain species of ergo fungus. It's pretty cool stuff. Dangerous, not necessarily something that we want to experiment with. Yet another Ascomycete, this one for forming its little asci around the outside of the swollen end of the hyphae, kind of like a fuzzball, like a microphone. This one is another black bread mold. Here we have our handy dandy rotten moldy bread. We have yet another group of fungus. We have yet another species of fungus, another type of fungus, in this case Aspergillus, a type of Ascomycete. Remember our Zygomycete black bread mold. We have another, our Zygomycete, our Ascomycete black bread mold, the Aspergillus, another species of Aspergillus type fungus, another type of bread mold fungus, is the one that when rice is inoculated with the spores of this species, a byproduct of the decomposition and fermentation of that rice is rice wine, which some people find quite nice. There is another Ascomycete that is incredibly specialized and has been reduced through specialization to nothing more than a little lump. A hungry lump, but a lump nonetheless. Saccharomyces. Saccharomyces, there's a whole bunch of different species of Saccharomyces. The ascocarpic Saccharomyces that are single-celled and reproduce by just making little buds. I'm going to use my pointer to circle a bud. There's a bud coming off of this one. And these could be buds to come, or these could be reproductive structures. I'm not quite sure, but these lumps are definitely the buds of these yeast organisms. So yeast is a fungus that doesn't form those mycelium, doesn't form the hyphae, doesn't form the tubes. They are incredibly specialized into just the hungry lumps that ingest sugar, absorb sugar like there's no tomorrow. Byproduct of all that ingestion and respiration, the byproduct, of course, is carbon dioxide that we use to raise the bread and to bubble the beer. So yeast, an incredibly environmentally important fungus, also an economically important fungus. Another economically important Ascomycete would be those that form problems, pests, not necessarily a disease, but a disfiguring situation, sooty mold. The soot is the mold growing through the sugars that have been excreted by sap-sucking insects. So the insects have sucked the sap, the sugary sap, out of this plant. There's too much sugary sap for those insects. It squirts almost directly out the other end, covering these leaves with a nice layer of sugar that the sooty mold grows through. Just like the yeast loves sugar. It's going to find raw sugar, it's going to grow and reproduce and cause this disfiguring outbreak, the sooty mold. Botrytis, you might have heard of botrytis. One is a pest, one is a plant pathogen, a garden disease. Another, botrytis, is actually referred to as the noble rot, because without botrytis infecting certain varieties of grape, certain types of wine cannot be produced. If it weren't for the presence of this botrytis cinerea, these grapes, when processed and fermented, would not yield the wine that they were intended to yield. So it takes this fungus to bestow the appellation upon certain types of wine. Now we have some unknowns. It's very possible that it is not very possible. It is certain that there are species, genera, groups of fungus that have yet to be described, have yet to be named. We take it upon ourselves here at the preserve to record and document as much as we can, to verify through various experts what we might be seeing. And we have a collection of images. We don't have specimens that we've necessarily collected and pressed, but we have images that are still undergoing verification as to identification. We're sure the yellow objects in this photograph are the fruiting bodies of a fungus. We are going out on a limb based on our years of study and experience in saying that the yellow structures in this photograph are the fruiting body of a fungus, but which one, we're not quite sure. We're guessing based on experience, a type of Spathularia, but we have sent images and time of year and all the data associated with where we found this organism growing to the experts, and we're waiting to hear back on if they agree, disagree, what other possibilities it might have. Here it is growing with some lichen. The pale kind of sea green organisms in this are lichen. We have a separate class, a separate everything on lichen. The fungal lichen is composed of fungus, algae, bacteria, yeast, all together at the same time. The fungal component, just one piece of the puzzle of lichen, is very often one of these kinds of Ascomycete fungus. But like I said, lichen is its own thing. Another photograph of another fungal fruiting body that we think is an Ascomycete called Trichoglossum, earth tongue, really, really descriptive. The Ascomycetes are often manifest as little cups. The asci, ASCI, remember the wineskins that have the asco spores inside, are very often produced lining the inside of these cup cup-shaped structures. And again, going back to the lichen, sometimes these cup-shaped structures are present in lichen because it's the fungal component expressing itself, forming those cup shapes. For more on lichen, do check out our YouTube channel for the life of lichen. It's a long-ish video, probably over 20 minutes long, but we try and give some clarification on just what it is we're talking about when we talk about lichen. Nudging very close to the territory of mushrooms, but not quite getting there, to avoid, in staying with the title of today's presentation, More Than Mushrooms, we are going to throw in an Ascomycete that is beloved by many, the morel mushroom or morel mushroom. This represents some of the ripened fruiting bodies of this fungus that spends, again, its life growing underground, branching, feeding, decomposing, eventually weaving the mycelium together into the fruiting body. In this case, coating the outside of that fruiting body and all these folds, increasing the surface area of that outside space, coating that outside with those ascocarps to release the spores to make more morels. The Basidiomycetes we'll finish up with. Basidio, these are the ones that have clubs. The way I remember this, Basidio was like a baseball bat. And that baseball bat is here. Here's the Basidium, the bat, and the little basidiospores are sitting on top of the bat. So it's a microscopic delineation between the Ascomycetes with the cups of spores and the Basidiomycetes that put their spores on the top of a basidium, on top of a little bat, a little club-shaped structure. But the Basidiomycetes are the ones that are going to make the majority of these toadstool mushrooms that we see. So the spores produced on the basidium, released, germinate and grow into the hyphae. We've all seen how fungus take it from there. There's a group of the Basidiomycete mushrooms that are referred to as the boletes. And instead of having gills on the underside of that cap, they have holes. They have little pores. And so the lining of these holes is where you find those little basidia with the spores. So the spores fall from the inside of these holes and get wafted off into the environment. There are no known toxic boletes. So that's pretty cool. A branch of the Basidiomycete clade of fungus whose fruiting bodies are not known to be toxic. And again, they are distinguished by having, instead of gills, they have the pores underneath. There's a group of bracket fungus that are referred to as the polypore group, because on the underside of this bracket, there are thousands, close to 1 million individual little holes where the basidiospores are going to fall out, germinate, hyphenate. I think I'm going to coin that. Turn into hyphae, turn into mycelium, grow, infect, decompose, and then when it's time to reproduce, form this this bracket fungus. It's one to know this particular type of polypore, this Ganoderma. This is a perennial fungal fruiting body. It lives from day to day, week to week, month to month, and often year to year. Most fruiting bodies emerge from their substrate, release the spores, and then disappear almost as quickly as they arise. The Ganoderma, this polypore bracket fungus, this type of Basidiomycete. These live for year after year after year and get bigger and bigger and older and older. If you see this kind of chestnut brown, brownish red, woody, you can knock on this one. It's actually referred to as a conch, C-O-N-K, because you can conch on it. This Ganoderma type fungus can be the sign of a dead tree. If it's not already dead, it's probably on the way out. If you find Ganoderma conchs on your oak tree, it's a bad sign. If you find Ganoderma conchs on your palm tree, it's definitely going to die if it's not already dead. So these conchs, these perennial Ganoderma conchs, can be diagnostic as far as future tree loss. A rather dramatic Basidiomycete, the tooth fungus or lion's mane fungus. This one growing on rotten wood, rotting wood. This one, the mycelium might be decomposing the already dead parts of a standing tree, but not killing that tree, just basically cleaning the scar tissue away from bits of the tree that have already died. So the tooth fungus, lion's mane fungus. Puffballs are a type of fungal fruiting body. These, when we first see them, are just spongy masses that might look like something laid some rather rough eggs on the surface of the soil, but about a day later, that outer layer of skin will have worn a hole in the center, and the Basidia will be releasing all of their spores to the inside. And then when pressure is placed on any of these surfaces, the single-celled spores are going to poof out the top and hopefully drift and land on the right substrate for them to carry on growing. Kind of a modified puffball. This is one that we find quite a bit out here at the preserve, are the earth stars, where they have it's basically a puffball with two layers of skin. The first layer opens and peels back into this characteristic star shape. The little, like if you took a globe and peeled back all the diamond-shaped bits of the globe, that's kind of what's happened here. The outer skin has peeled off, revealing this inner puffball shape. Geastrum, literally earth star, reproductive form of this detritivore, ground-dwelling fungal. The violet blue spread was one of the first of the temperate fungus that got my attention at university. Went to university in a place in Tennessee with a very, very rich, diverse, dense forest, the mixed mesoforest of the eastern United States at its most primordial, and found a stick that had this violet blue spread fungal fruiting body mass on it. And I realized I needed to spend the rest of my life learning about stuff like that. Bringing us here today, bringing us here to 310 on December 8th. A fascinating and really not too hard to find if you know where to look. The bird's nest fungus is a representative Basidiomycete fungus, even though it forms this little splash cup that harkens back to the cup-shaped forms of the Ascomycetes. The cup is really a dispersal mechanism for these little spore packages, the eggs of the bird's nest, so that when if a raindrop were to fall vertically into this splash cup, hit the side, and then with its momentum continue to rush around the rim and splash out the other side, it would hopefully carry one or more of these little spore bundles with it. So this is a fungus that has actually created kind of like a skateboard park in order to get lift for its little spore bundles. And these are the bird's nest fungus. You'll often find these decomposing mulch. If you are a master gardener and you happen to work at a diagnostic desk, you may have seen these come in as a what in the hell has come into my garden question. These little things with dots in them, what am I looking at? Well, you're looking at bird's nest fungus. Harmless, decomposer, just trying to reproduce, just trying to do its reproductive thing. Some of our favorites, the stinkhorns. Charming name. This intrepid photographer has got very close, very close to this coming out of the ground, this stinkhorn. And it gets its name because it stinks and it comes out of the ground as this kind of columnar shape. Clathrus is the genus of this particular one. The inside of this kind of fleshy colored structure, this whole structure is meant to fool filth breeding flies. Coevolution at its finest. So here we have the stinkhorn emerging out of the ground, and it's hollow on the inside. And look who's come to visit. Let's zoom in on that a little bit. We have this curious little fly that's attracted to dead meat. The flies that lay their eggs on dead meat for the eggs to hatch and grow into maggots that feed on dead meat. This fungus is so repulsive, the smell and the color are mimicking a dead animal, and they fool the flies, the filth breeding flies, to come in to lay their eggs. And it's not the egg laying activity that does the fungus any good whatsoever. It's the flies walking around on the surface, actually on the inner surface of this structure. They're picking up spores on their feet, sticky spores on their feet, unknowingly, thinking that they've landed on a nice dead possum or something. They haven't. They've landed on this mimic, this stinkhorn, that has put, in this case, this genus is Phallus, and the spore-producing goo is actually on the outer surface here. It's kind of this grayish-green color. That material is called gleba, Gleba, and it gets all over the feet of these flies that think they found something wonderful, but it's not dead meat at all. It's just pretending. So when the flies leave and clean themselves off, they're depositing these spores far away from the parent. There's a very grand species of stinkhorn in the genus Phallus. This one is the netted stinkhorn, and it is very often, occasionally, if you look for fungus, okay, I'll admit it, if you look for fungus on the internet, you are likely to see photographs of this because it is so unbelievable that it forms this grand three-dimensional veil structure, the netted stinkhorn. And keeping you a little bit longer, I always do this and I apologize. We're promising 2022. We'll keep these a little bit more, a little shorter, a little bit less of a investment into your day. We'll just do some short and sweet. We'll finish up with some decomposers of decomposers, because let's face it, life cycles don't end once the action of one decomposer is done. Then what do? When your mushroom's dead, what happens to the mushroom? What happens to the bird's nest fungus structure once it's decomposed its surroundings? There's still something left over. In comes this group, the jelly fungus. And the jelly fungus have specialized in their ability to find the dead and dying bodies of their brethren and sestrin to decompose even further. So the jelly fungus, which are quite visible, especially after rains on rotting wood, they come in and decompose the previous decomposers. Does that make sense? These are known, I think, to be edible. Again, I don't really want to go there because it's not my thing, but they're quite fun just to find because you can really freak out your sister with them if you chase them around with a stick with some jelly fungus on it. No gleba, nothing to come off, nothing to smell like dead animals. One even has the fanciful name, which we met early on as witch's butter, as if they just appeared out of nowhere overnight. So they must have some sort of supernatural connotation. And the last, auricularia, auricularia because it looks like an ear. Auricularia Judy, it's Judas ear. I think, I don't know my Bible stories very well, but I think everybody got mad at Judas because he wasn't a very good person in the Bible, and they chopped his ear off and tossed it. And so now, because it was cursed, it shows up here and there, somehow in the eastern United States woodlands, as a growth coming out of a tree. So again, that's enough. Like I said, we weren't even scratching the surface of the diversity of the fungal kingdom, if we want to stick to the concept of kingdoms. That's enough for now. We took a look at the possibilities, and each and every single one of these groups and more could be explored even further as a lecture on their own. But enough for today. Appreciate the world around you. Conserve, preserve, appreciate the complexity and how everything is knitted together. Thank you very much for joining us. And we do certainly hope that you will tune in next month for, what did I say? We're doing the Wood Wide Web. We'll expand on the mycorrhizal associations and the role that the fungus plays in the bigger scheme of things in an entire ecosystem. We'll look at a forest ecosystem for this one. In the meantime, do not hesitate to contact via email, J. Stevenson, first initial last name, J. Stevenson at pinellascounty.org. Must make you aware, if you are not already, that we do have a field guide available at the IFAS bookstore that was created right here in Pinellas County for residents of Central Florida, an easy way to tell commonly confused species of plants and animals. Sadly, we don't have the fungus issue out yet, but I won't promise, but I will suggest that maybe we're working on it. But for now, take a look at our Beginner's Guide to Commonly Misidentified Animals and Plants by visiting the ufl.edu bookstore, the IFAS bookstore. Our presentation today, or a version thereof, will be found at our Pinellas Extension YouTube channel. We have most of our videos posted there in various playlists, so you can go back and watch, send a link to a friend. We really appreciate your patronizing our YouTube channel. Again, we don't get any money from it. We produce this just because we're good people, and it's our mission to do. For upcoming information, for the very latest information on upcoming programs, events, news of the Brooker Creek Preserve, or any of our presentations or educational offerings, join us on Facebook. Look especially for Brooker Creek Environmental Education Center. That's the Facebook group that we, the educators here at UF Extension, Pinellas County, are maintaining. So with that, do we have any questions? Thank you. Thank you. Yes, it will be posted for later viewing. Thank you for joining us. Got a lot of thanks. Really appreciate your attention. And now, Please do go and enjoy this lovely afternoon, and thanks again for joining us today. And I'm out.